So happy Earth Day. This is my 47th year of celebrating Earth Day ever since I was in grade 10 and organized on the first Earth Day, April 22nd, 1970. So I'm also irate. I'm really irate. I've only got 15 minutes, and I can tell you when I did my final argument at the National Energy Board, they gave me 40 minutes and I used every nanosecond. So you can go online and find my final argument. But I've decided for being irate, island residents against tanker expansion, there are a few other T's I thought I'd throw in there because it applies to tankers, right? It applies to tar sands. But I'm going to frame my presentation to you today around being against another T, total stupidity. Now this will mean that irate can also take on fighting fracking, opposing LNG, and over there on the map of Salish Sea we see the insanity of Steelhead LNG and a floating LNG terminal in the Saanich Inlet. Don't assume it won't happen because it's so stupid, it's unbelievable. We have to organize and mobilize against that. And also on the in the category of big fat total stupidity, Site C. So these are things that we need to oppose for many good and sensible reasons. Because total stupidity means that these projects are not only disastrous for the environment, offensive to First Nations rights, they also make no economic sense. And that's where I want to come into the Kinder Morgan issue with you, because one can assume that we understand that it's going to be a really bad idea to expand any infrastructure that has to do with oil sands on a planet where we need to move off fossil fuels as quickly as possible. There are a lot of arguments, there are a lot of issues, but one that gets missed a lot is the economic one. So as the only member of Parliament who was an intervener and fought at the final argument before Kinder Morgan's National Energy Board panel, one of the things I did, because I'm kind of thorough in my work, was I printed out Kinder Morgan's so-called environmental impact statement. You might be interested to know that when you print it out, it came to 23,000 pages. Then what I did was took it apart. I took all the bits that were duplicative and exactly the same language over and over again and put that in one big pile. That cut it down by about a half. Then I looked at this and thought, okay, well, what other stuff can I set aside? Well, they had a really, really, really long volumes of descriptions of the current situation in BC, our current economy, our current beautiful environment, and of course the whole pipeline route from Alberta, pipeline route expanding down through. They covered many risks in great detail. One that we would never have thought of, for instance, that construction workers building the pipeline would blunder into poultry barns, thus spreading avian flu. I kid you not. They talk about how the construction workers will be wearing little rubber booties, little plastic bags over their boots, and they will have to have foot baths. No one is worried about Kinder Morgan's pipeline expansion creating a risk of avian flu, nor were we worried. My favorite line from this whole 23,000 pages of garbage was, milk cows can be curious. Wow, who knew? The science, the intelligence, the rigor of Kinder Morgan's application is unspeakable. Milk cows could be curious, so in anthropomorphizing milk cows, they decided there might be a problem where they'd be fascinated by construction workers, and so interested in them that it would affect lactation and production. They satisfied themselves that these milk cows would be less curious when they got used to the construction workers. God knows I can't imagine a cow being able to give milk if there was Kinder Morgan nearby, but still. This is the garbage, right? So why did they produce a 23,000 page application? So that it would intimidate anyone from trying to read it. So that sheer volume would replace rigor. So buried in all that garbage, where was the thing I was looking for? Evidence of how bitumen, which is a solid, it's not even really like tar, because tar might flow, you know. Bitumen is a solid. I sometimes use a little glass jar full of bitumen and turn it upside down so people can see it's not dripping, but it's really hard to transport that thing back and forth on flights, so I don't have it with me today. I keep it in Ottawa where I need it more. Bitumen mixed with diluent. How will it behave in the marine environment? That's the key thing we need to know. Now, why do we need to know that? Before I get to that, I'm going to go back to Bob's brilliant example and Bob's brilliant presentation, and the Bunce Field example where you saw exactly how the brilliant technology has all these mechanisms to make sure nothing can go wrong. Reminded me a lot, the little missing padlock and the oil that goes over, reminded me so much of the Enbridge spill in Kalamazoo, Michigan. Because that's the first time that we really turned our attention to, wait a minute, this isn't even crude oil. This isn't oil at all. This is bitumen mixed with diluent, and how will it behave? Now in Kalamazoo, Michigan, Enbridge had a pipeline break and a huge pipeline spill into the Kalamazoo River. It was investigated. There's a wonderful report by the U.S. National Transportation Commission. They were the ones who had to do the report on the Enbridge spill. The Enbridge spill, by the way, in the Kalamazoo River was, I think now 6 years ago, and is still not cleaned up because you can't clean up bitumen mixed with diluent. But the safety features were worth mentioning. On the day in which they released this report, the U.S. Transportation Commission described Enbridge as having a culture of negligence. In the control room, of course, any pipeline break sets off alarms. And if I had more time, I'd tell you exactly the sequence of events, but to shorten it up, just say, the Enbridge crew in the control room acted about those alarms exactly the same way you and I would act if a piece of toast was stuck in our toaster, setting off a smoke alarm in the home. You just wave a cookie sheet till the alarm goes off. Yeah, they ran around shutting off all the alarms. They went home for the day, the next shift came on, they never told the next shift, by the way, we had some alarms. The next shift poured oil through a broken pipeline because they didn't. And you can't clean it up. Bitumen mixed with diluent can't be cleaned up. So where in these 23,000 pages of Kinder Morgan's rigorous assessment of risk did they deal with this problem of bitumen mixed with diluent and how it will behave in the marine environment? Well, there's one study that they did. It is not peer-reviewed. It was in Gainesfield, Alberta. Over a one-time only 10-day period, they took a big tank of water, fresh water, to which they added salt and stirred. And they said, this represents Burrard Inlet. And then they did it in the summer, so all of their parameters were off. They wanted to keep the temperature to something like what you'd have in Burrard Inlet, but it actually got to about 23 degrees in that water, so that wasn't quite right, but they said, that's like Burrard Inlet in summer. And then they poured in bitumen mixed with diluent and said, boom, it behaves just like regular crude, we'll be able to skim it off. That's it. That is the sum total of Kinder Morgan's evidence. Now, I used to practice law. The first time I appeared before the National Energy Board as a counsel was in 1981 when I was still a law student representing people who wanted to stop the nuclear reactor at Point Lepreau. So I'm familiar with the fact that the National Energy Board is a quasi-judicial tribunal. I'm also familiar with what the National Energy Board is equipped to do. And the National Energy Board is unequivocally not equipped to do environmental assessments. And they never had done them before until Bill C-38, the Omnibus Budget Bill of spring 2012, that destroyed our environmental laws and put the National Energy Board in charge of this. Right? So the National Energy Board decided that they had to do fast work to approve Kinder Morgan. That's why there could be no time for cross-examination, but we could ask paper questions. The paper questions were all answered not by whatever team of whiz kids did this 10-day study in a tank of fresh water to which they added salt. There was no way to get any questions answered by those folks. Oh, it even gets funnier. There was one, it wasn't just the one tank, they also did a study in a 5-gallon pail. And in that one, they noted that it would have been good if the equipment had allowed for them to measure the spill because their ruler wasn't big enough to actually measure the spill in the plastic bucket. Now, I'm not kidding. That's their evidence. Now, I tried to produce for the National Energy Board in this hearing the review by Canada's premier scientific academy, the Royal Society of Canada. They did a review of how bitumen and diluent will behave in the marine environment and concluded that nobody knows how to clean it up, it will form small, you'll get oil balls that sink. The diluent, which by the way is just a term that means stuff you use to dilute solid stuff, it has no chemical definition. And the amount of diluent they would use would depend on the time of year, so they'll put more diluent in the mix of dilbit in winter to keep the stuff flowing, but it's basically fossil fuel condensate, naphtha, basically think of that, to which they add benzene. cancer-causing, and butane. So not only in this tank farm example of the explosion on Burnaby Mountain will you have smoke, fire, and risk, you'll also have carcinogens. Bitumen itself, by the way, newsflash for Justin Trudeau, who believed he made a statement. I think he actually believed his statement was evidence-based. He said, pipelines are safer than trains. Pipelines are safer than trains. You have to ask a basic question. For what material? If you're talking about Bakken shale from North Dakota that blew up in Lac Mégantic, that might be true. Pipelines, but basically, Bakken shale crude shouldn't be transported at all. It is massively dangerous stuff. If you're shipping bitumen, the safest way to ship it is by train. Safe as houses. You have to heat it up a bit, the technology is you heat it up enough to get it into a rail car where it then solidifies. If it were to fall off a rail path at a high place and fall into a stream below, and the entire casing of the train were to break open, it would not only not blow up, it would also not spill. It would lie there like a lump. I've talked to workers in the oil sands who've tried to get bitumen to catch fire by using a blowtorch on it. They can't get it to do anything. But why would we want to ship bitumen out of Canada? Which comes to another piece of important evidence before the National Energy Board. And this was the evidence of Unifor. Talk about your economic evidence. The largest trade union representing the workers in the oil sands. Unifor intervened in the Kinder Morgan process to oppose the pipeline because of the threat to jobs posed by the pipeline. They specifically are concerned about the Chevron refinery. So if you go back to when Kinder Morgan first built its pipeline, it was shipping actual crude oil to 4 refineries in the Lower Mainland. Chevron's the last one. Chevron cannot refine bitumen mixed with diluent. So if you know the economics of why it's crazy to ship raw logs, solid wood off Vancouver Island, where our sawmills can't get raw material to keep the saw logs running and the sawmill running, because we're shipping out raw product for export. It's the same problem for Chevron. They can't get access to enough crude to keep that refinery operating at full production levels already. Because of the transitioning that Sheila was mentioning, where Kinder Morgan began shipping more bitumen mixed with diluent for export, which the NEB approved without looking at any questions of energy security for Canada or the effect on employment. No. Kinder Morgan started shipping bitumen mixed with diluent for export at sufficient quantities that Chevron has already laid off 1/3 of its workers and reduced its production by 1/3 because it can't get access to material that it's capable of refining. So Unifor went to the National Energy Board to say, don't approve Kinder Morgan, it will cost Canadian jobs. It will cost jobs for workers we have right now at the Chevron refinery, and it will cost jobs long-term in the oil sands. What did the National Energy Board do with that evidence? They refused to hear it. They said their jurisdiction and mandate did not include looking at jobs or the economy. Why the hell wasn't that front page news somewhere? Because the way the rest of Canada hears the story of Kinder Morgan, they hear it like this. The country, in its national interest, needs pipelines, but those irrational British Columbians are just selfish and don't want to take the risk with our environment to help jobs elsewhere. Wait a minute. There's no economic case for Kinder Morgan. And there is absolutely no case that you can have a world-class spill response for a substance that no one knows how to clean up. I sometimes wonder about it, whether in their fevered brain they imagine that all these vessels, which by the way are owned by Kinder Morgan, the majority interest in the cleanup spill company of Western Marine Resources, it's owned by Kinder Morgan. Well, anyway, they're going to rush to the scene, and perhaps human tears will clean up bitumen spilled with diluent, but there is no evidence for that either. What we do know from a DFO study, DFO actually used, imagine this, actual seawater from the Atlantic Ocean and actually simulated what it's really like, including all its particulate matter, bits of seaweed, bits of sand mixed up with the churning waters. And they put in bitumen mixed with diluent in a controlled experiment and realized you can't clean this up. The National Energy Board refused to hear the evidence of the Royal Society of Canada or any studies that showed that bitumen mixed with diluent can't be cleaned up, because they said that evidence came along too late in the process and it would be unfair to Kinder Morgan. So the National Energy Board also accepted evidence from Kinder Morgan that was falsified, fraudulent evidence. The National Energy Board's conduct of this hearing is one huge scandal. And it should never have been allowed that this evidence then, as we've already heard, Trudeau broke the promise that said we'd start from the beginning again. Derek Corrigan's absolutely right. They didn't look at the tank farm evidence that an explosion would leave the university at Simon Fraser stranded, that affect a community. They didn't look at the evidence that at every stream crossing, there's a risk of bitumen and diluent spilling, and you cannot clean it up in a freshwater environment. We know that for sure, because that's the Kalamazoo River experience. What we don't know for sure is exactly how bad it will be. But we do know that there is no economic case whatsoever for Canada to ship out raw bitumen. We know from a study done in the US on the Keystone Pipeline, the environmental assessment report that went to former Secretary of State John Kerry, we know from that report that if you are building a pipeline and the price of a barrel of oil is over $80 a barrel, building that pipeline will have no impact on expanding greenhouse gases, because the expansion in the oil sands would happen anyway. The corollary of that is when the price of a barrel of oil is below $80 a barrel, any additional infrastructure to ship out material will cause a pressure to expand and increase greenhouse gases and cause the oil sands, which otherwise are shrinking. Have you noticed how many multinationals are pulling out of the oil sands? They pulled out of it Stat Oil of Norway, Shell, and ConocoPhillips. Again, this is not front page news in Canada because we have to desperately cling to the idea that the oil sands are in our national interest, even though at their peak, they represented 3% of GDP. So there's a lot more I'd love to get to about what's wrong with this project. But one can say unequivocally, there's not one single good reason at all to allow the Kinder Morgan expansion. We will stop it. We must stop it. And if we can stop it in court, by the way, we're talking First Nations cases here and helping to fund those. But I also want you to know that the case that the City of Vancouver is bringing forward was so good that that's why I didn't go to court to make the case that the hearing process, the lack of cross-examination, the abbreviated hearings, the bias displayed throughout. This project is going to go to court using approximately a dozen different legal arguments, including Indigenous rights, and on any one of those dozen legal arguments, this project goes down to defeat. So we will keep working. There's a March for the Salish Sea. I want to mention that. Walk for the Salish Sea, May 25th, starting at mile 0 in Victoria, walking to Kinder Morgan in Burnaby by May 28th. So join us for the walk. We will stop this project because it is outrageous and stands on its own as one of the best examples of total stupidity I've run across in my entire lifetime of fighting stupid projects. Thank you.